Good evening. This right here is the movie 2000 Mules. It was released just a few days ago in theaters across the country, and it exposes the illegal ballot harvesting that took place during the 2020 presidential election. By the way, I should mention that I was at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort just a few days ago covering the red carpet premiere for this film, and I got to interview a lot of the VIPs there. If you want to check out those phenomenal interviews, you can see them all over on EpochTV. I'll throw a link. It'll be down in the description box below. However, getting back to the actual movie, one of the main ways that it exposed the illegal ballot harvesting is by using geospatial cell phone tracking data. And by using this data, they were able to figure out, to trace the individuals who were making dozens of trips to ballot drop boxes as well as to different NGOs. However, well, as expected, once this movie was actually released, the mainstream media began to attack it. And one of the main criticisms that have been lobbied against it is the idea that this cell phone geo-tracking data is not very precise or accurate. That's, for instance, what the independent fact-checkers at the Associated Press and PolitiFact have to say. But is what they say really the case? Because when they were tracking January 6th protesters or certain people that were at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort, well, in that case, the New York Times referred to this technique as offering precise location of the target individuals. Furthermore, it's not only the New York Times that validated this technique. That's because, according to this relatively bombshell story that came out of Vice magazine, of all places, according to government documents obtained by Vice magazine, the CDC purchased the cell phone ping data of tens of millions of American citizens across the entire country in order to, among other things, quote, perform analysis of compliance with curfews, track patterns of people visiting K-12 schools, and specifically monitor the effectiveness of policy in the Navajo Nation. And not only did they purchase this data, but apparently they used it to great effect, because within the pages of these documents, the CDC wrote that the cell phone tracking data had been, quote, critical for ongoing response efforts, such as hourly monitoring of activity in curfew zones or detailed counts of visits to participating pharmacies for vaccine monitoring. And just for your reference, these documents came from last year, from 2021. But the best part, at least in my opinion, is that according to these documents, although the CDC used COVID as the pretext for why they needed to expedite the purchase of this data, well, the documents clearly show that the CDC intended to use this data for much more than just COVID. Because you see, the procurement document here clearly states, quote, this is an urgent COVID-19 procurement request, and they asked for the purchase to be expedited. However, in a separate section of this document, the section where the CDC actually explains what they're going to be using this data for, well, they clearly elaborate that they will be using this data for non-COVID related programs as well. Here's part of what this section says, quote, we will be tracking all those people who don't smash that like button, as well as those who don't subscribe to the Facts Matter YouTube channel. Now, I'm of course just kidding about that part, but I'm also not kidding, and I do hope that you take a moment to smash both that like button as well as that subscribe button. Regardless, though, getting back to the actual document, here's what the CDC really said about using this data for non-COVID related purposes. Quote, the CDC also plans to use mobility data and services acquired through this acquisition to support non-COVID-19 programmatic areas and public health priorities across the agency, including, but not limited to, travel to parks and green spaces, physical activity and mode of travel, and population migration before, during, and after natural disasters. The mobility data obtained under this contract will be available for CDC agency-wide use and will support numerous CDC priorities, meaning that the data was purchased with the pretext of COVID, but as the agency clearly stated right there, well, the entire agency and all of its many departments can use the data for their own purposes. Furthermore, the CDC actually goes on to then list 21 specific use cases for this tracking data. You can see that up on the screen for yourself. And indeed, there are many use cases listed there which are not explicitly linked to COVID, such as research points of interest for physical activity and chronic disease prevention, such as visits to parks, gyms, or weight management businesses. Furthermore, within this list, there is another point that I wanted to highlight, which is actually related to COVID. Here's what it says, quote, impact of state limitations on close person-to-person contacts outside the household, comparing gatherings density in 2019 and 2020. Meaning that the CDC was using the cell phone tracking data to look at the relative density of certain venues and certain events to see, among other things, whether people were crowding or if they had the space to keep 6 feet apart as the CDC recommended. And so what this means in practice is that the CDC trusted this data so much that they paid close to $500,000 in order to get access to it. They used it to track people granularly in all sorts of scenarios, both COVID and non-COVID across the entire country. But when election researchers used the same technique to track people who were illegally trafficking ballots in the 2020 election, well, the independent fact checkers suddenly came out and began to suggest that this technique was unreliable. It's funny how that works. Regardless though, this story actually goes much, much deeper than that, because the CDC was not the only government agency working overtime to track their citizens. All right, the sponsor of today's episode is a phenomenal company called AMAC. That's AMAC, and it stands for the Association of Mature American Citizens. They are quite literally one of the fastest growing conservative organizations in all of America, and you should consider joining for three main reasons. The first is the money saving benefit, because as a member of AMAC, you get access to a ton of discounts at many different verticals. Things like vitamin stores, restaurants, retail shops, and so on and so forth. If you want to check out the full list, it's pretty exhaustive, you can do so over on AMAC's website. The second benefit is that you get exclusive access to the AMAC magazine. It'll be delivered directly to your doorstep, and it contains phenomenal coverage as well as deep analysis. And then the third benefit, the one that people say is their favorite, is that AMAC fights for your values over on Capitol Hill. In fact, you can check out the online version of this on their website. It's the AMAC Action Advocacy Annual Report, and it shows exactly what they're doing on Capitol Hill in terms of fighting what they call the socialist storm that's brewing in this country. So head on over to amac.us/factsmatter and sign up today. I'll also throw a link down in the description box below. That's right, our polite neighbors to the north, meaning of course the Canadian government, well, they were using the exact same technique as the CDC in order to track their citizens during the COVID lockdown. According to a report that was obtained by the Ethics Committee of Canada's House of Commons, a company called Blue Dot, which works within the field of intelligence analysis, they were submitting movement reports of Canadian citizens to the Public Health Agency of Canada. Movements which were tracked and reported without the consent or even the knowledge of the actual citizens, or in other words, exactly like how the CDC was doing it. And according to a representative from this company, from Blue Dot, here are among some of the metrics which they were being asked to track. Quote, for example, point of interest data from Blue Dot identifies the number of visits to grocery stores, parks, liquor stores, and hospitals. All we receive is the location of the point of interest and the number of visits for a specific day. And then furthermore, the CEO of Blue Dot, Mr. Kamran Khan, he came out once this report was made public, and he made a point to say that his company's work was not really about tracking the minute movement of Canadian citizens, but instead, it was about protecting people from infectious disease. Here's specifically what he said, once again, after this report was brought to light. Quote, our only goal is to help protect lives and livelihoods from infectious diseases, which requires intelligence about overall trends in populations. None of the information ever includes demographic information or specific identifiers or anything like a name, telephone number, email, or address. However, despite the data being anonymized, well, conservative members of the Canadian Parliament, they made the argument that the Canadian Health Agency should have, for one, at least told the Canadian citizens that their movements were being potentially monitored, and secondly, given them the option to opt out. Here's, for instance, what Mr. Damien Kirk, who's a conservative member of Parliament, here's what he said in regards to this report. Quote, questions remain about the specifics of the data provided, if Canadians' rights were violated, and what advice the Liberal government was given. However, there's something much more broad that I believe is worth mentioning here, which is that these cases of previously unthinkable government conduct, well, they are becoming more and more commonplace. And as a prime example of what I actually mean by that, about 15 months ago, the Canadian Armed Forces suddenly found themselves in some relatively hot water after it was brought to light that they had drawn up plans for multiple psychological operations which were intended to target the Canadian citizens themselves during the early onset of the COVID outbreak. Let me just repeat that. During the early onset of the COVID outbreak, when it was wreaking havoc on senior citizens who were living in nursing homes, the Canadian government called on the Canadian Armed Forces to do something about it. And so, the Canadian Armed Forces, they set up something called Operation Laser, which would attempt to both shape as well as to exploit the information that was being given to Canadian citizens in order to minimize civil disobedience, as well as to bolster the government's messaging about the pandemic. Specifically, Operation Laser had three main official objectives. One was to save lives. Two was to assist the federal, provincial, territorial, and regional partners, meaning the regional governments, and three, to maintain Canadian Armed Forces readiness, effectiveness, and resilience, which of course all sounds well and good. However, about 15 months ago, the Ottawa Citizens News Organization, they obtained the actual documents that were related to Operation Laser through the Access to Information Law, which is Canada's equivalent to our Freedom of Information Act request. And according to the documents that they were able to obtain, Operation Laser contained within it a section dedicated to information operations. And just for clarification, in case you've never heard of it, what are known as information operations typically take the form of psychological operations, intelligence gathering, as well as information dissemination. And very typically, these things are done against foreign entities. In fact, here's how the Canadian forces themselves define information operations. Quote, actions taken in support of political and military objectives which influence decision makers by affecting others' information while exploiting and protecting one's own information. Which sounds all well and good when you're talking about utilizing these types of tactics on North Korea, China, or Cuba, but it's a whole different matter when you're explicitly talking about using psychological warfare tactics against your own populace, which might sound like hyperbole, but listen to what this specific section of the government document actually says. And just for your reference, this document comes from the Canadian Joint Operations Command. And here's what it says, quote, Operation Laser represents an important opportunity, not just for the Canadian Armed Forces to assist Canadians at a time of crisis, but also to grow and define the relationship between Canadians and their military. This will potentially shape the Canadian national dialogue on military and security culture into the future. Okay, so just to pause here, so far it sounds all well and good. You have the military going out and helping the different provinces to combat COVID. Great. However, the subsection continues, quote, under Operation Laser, there has been no confirmed targeted adversarial information activities that specifically seek to undermine, weaken, disrupt, or degrade the Government of Canada's response to the crisis. However, the existence of mis- or disinformation in the information environment constitutes what may be characterized as a contest information environment, where unofficial actors and sources of information have and will continue to emerge to compete with the attention, focus, and understanding of Canadians. Such efforts are not currently attributable to foreign powers or any malign intent, but their adverse effects must be mitigated nonetheless. Now, just to pause here for a quick moment. When I first read that statement, it frankly was chilling because the document acknowledges that they have no evidence of a foreign actor trying to sow discord. But just the fact that there are narratives that run counter to the official government narrative is enough of a threat that it needs to be mitigated. Or in other words, the Canadian Armed Forces, despite recognizing that there are no identifiable threats of either misinformation or disinformation, they intended to take it upon themselves to launch an information operation campaign against the Canadian citizens in order for a pro-government narrative to win out and to drown out all alternative viewpoints. However, the document actually then continues, quote, further, the nature of this pandemic and the measures taken across the globe and in Canada have increased population levels of anxiety, stress, fear, and distrust. Measures such as self-isolation and physical distancing have resulted in a real and perceived loss of freedom and personal agency from individual Canadians. This disempowerment and general context of anxiety will lead to increases in irrational behaviors which may run counter the overall response effort and public well-being. The Canadian Armed Forces must support the Government of Canada in mitigating this overall perspective of fear and anxiety to promote and enable a rational, fact-based response to this crisis. Meaning that the actions taken by the Canadian government might make the Canadian citizens feel like their freedoms are being infringed upon, and they might voice their opposition, which could undercut the intention of the government. And therefore, the Canadian Armed Forces must work to counteract this inevitability. Now, as you can imagine, when this actually came to light, it was a shock to the Canadian public. Even more so, because according to public statements, the Canadian Defense Minister, Mr. Harjit Sajjan, he was apparently kept in the dark about this plan. And it was only after he was briefed by senior leaders, when the Ottawa Citizen News Organization started asking questions about Operation Laser, that he apparently learned about this whole plan. And when he did, he ordered an internal investigation to be carried out in order to figure out who actually thought this was a good idea to execute information operations on Canadian soil. However, this is where the story takes a really weird turn. Because at the very same time that the public is learning about Operation Laser, while the military leaders are denying that they're using information operations on Canadian citizens, and while this internal investigation is ongoing, well, a different story suddenly broke. That's because on October 7th of 2020, Vice News reported that a reserve unit of the Canadian military was conducting official training exercises when somehow they managed to quote-unquote accidentally mail fake training flyers to the citizens living in the surrounding area. And those fake flyers, you can see them up on screen for yourself, were mailed to the residents of Kings County, Nova Scotia, informing them that a pack of 8 wolves were released into the wild by the Department of Lands and Forestry. Now, naturally enough, when you receive a letter like that in the mail, you get freaked out, which is exactly what happened. The residents got freaked out and they started to call their local government officials. However, it turns out that those letters weren't real. The Canadian military revealed that these were actually mock letters, which were, again, apparently intended to be distributed only internally to the units at the training area. The military claimed that the letters were supposed to be sent to the units, and then they were supposed to be accompanied by the sound of howling, of wolves howling coming out of hidden loudspeakers in order to demonstrate to the Canadian soldiers a technique of information operations and the impact that it can have on a population. Essentially, they were trying to show the soldiers that if you mail them such letters and then you can hear the sound of wolves, well, people will freak out, which is exactly what happened. However, these letters, which were intended only for the Army units, somehow, at the very same time that Operation Laser is happening in the background, somehow the letters were sent to the actual Canadian citizens living in that area. Now, a couple of days after this story broke, the head of media relations for the Department of National Defense, he had to come out and tell the media this, quote, "The creation of these letters and their contents, even if never meant for public consumption, was wrong." According to the official account, what happened was that a junior officer found the letters, thought they were real, and somehow was able to send them out to the people living in that area, which actually seemed to mimic what happened to Operation Laser as a whole. That's because the official internal investigation surrounding Operation Laser and its focus on information warfare, well, it found that apparently the whole thing was written by a single corporal, and then it happened to be rubber stamped by many of the senior leaders in the Canadian military. In fact, according to their final audit report, I have it right here, this whole section on conducting PSYOPs within the country, well, it was included, quote, "due in large part to the general acceptance by many senior leaders within the Canadian Joint Operations Command of the idea that information operations are a part of Canadian Armed Forces operations no matter where they take place." Furthermore, they also claimed that this aspect of Operation Laser never went into effect since the guidance never made it down to the troop level. Then, in order to clean up the general mess, the spokesperson of the Canadian Armed Forces, he had to come out once again and give this statement, quote, "The Canadian Armed Forces fully recognize that problematic information operation activities caused reputational damage to Canadian military. Direction has been issued to improve how the Canadian Armed Forces operates in the information environment while protecting and enhancing public trust. Maintaining the trust of Canadians is critical to the Canadian military's mission. We will strive for continuous improvement and are committed to working tirelessly to maintain this trust." And frankly, as reassuring as that sounds, it definitely begs a bigger question, which is how many information operations are going on around us right now and we just don't know about it? Because even though the Canadian military had to walk back Operation Laser, well, the way that the document was written does give us a glimpse into the thinking of the people who have the capability to run psychological operations in Canada and frankly here in America as well. And apparently they can rationally justify doing so, well, if the situation calls for it. If you'd like to read any of the documents that we discussed in today's episode, such as the documents relating to the CDC's tracking of Americans, the Canadian government's tracking of their citizens, or about this Operation Laser, I will throw all those links into the description box below this video for you to check out. And also, I would like to give a big shout out to Mr. Eric Schumacher. He's not only an American veteran, but he's also the new researcher here at Facts Matter. He helped to pull together a lot of the information for today's episode. And I'm sure that if he could, he would agree with me, and he would suggest that you smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Now lastly, as I mentioned at the very beginning of today's episode, a few days ago, I was over at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort where I was filming an exclusive episode on the red carpet in regards to the premiere of 2000 Mules. Here's a trailer. All right, so we are here at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort for the global premiere of 2000 Mules, which is, of course, the film by Dinesh D'Souza exposing the illegal ballot harvesting that took place around the entire country during the 2020 election. And as you can see behind us, there's a red carpet that's stretched out, so let's go for a walk and see who we can grab. So Dinesh, what actually led you to make this film?
What led me to make the film was a series of meetings with Catherine Engelbrecht and Greg Phillips, who are the two principals at the group called True the Vote. It's an election intelligence organization. And they showed Debbie, my wife, and me some of their research that they were looking at. And we realized that this was of a different caliber than anything we had seen before.
Now it goes without saying that many of the opinions expressed on that red carpet, well, it wouldn't be allowed here on YouTube. That is just, frankly, the world we live in. And so if you'd like to check out that full exclusive episode, you can head on over to EpochTV and check it out for yourself. EpochTV is, of course, our no-censorship video platform. The link will be right there at the very top of the description box. I hope you check it out because those interviews are, frankly, awesome. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed and stay free.